Hey, it's a Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, Its Ideology and History by Salim Maujais, and we'll be reading The National Landscape. The ideology of the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, the SSNP, was formulated to readdress the conditions responsible for Syria's decadence and suffering, to define a desired future state, and to chart and execute the course towards that future state. The elements of Syria were myriad. Divisions among sectarian and ethnic lines, a corrupt political class, and an absence of a unified national consciousness, all accompanied by a colonial intervention. When Sadat returned to Syria in 1930 to found the SSNP, he encountered a country truncated by colonial interventions and burdened by the acceleration of social ills of historic proportions. The Allied Conference at San Remo on April 24, 1920, had partitioned the former Ottoman territory into British and French mandates, in effect formalizing the secret Sykes-Picot agreements of 1916. The delineations of territory between British and French spheres of influence, as well as within their respective allocations, was the first subject of compromise and constant change. The Franco-British Convention of December 23, 1920, defined the general boundary for Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq, but the agreed-upon boundaries were arbitrary and subject to the interests of negotiating parties. The most conscientious demarcations were understandably those between the French and British areas of domination. The stories of the boundaries between the French and the British areas is as instructive as one complicates the narratives that will later emerge in support of the artificial proto-states. Between Lebanon and Palestine, the British proposed a boundary from Sidon eastward to include the lower Litani Valley. The French counter-proposals remained close to Sykes-Picot boundary, which ran close to Safed. The final agreement placed the boundary a few miles north of the Sykes-Picot line. Hence, the demarcation between Lebanon and Palestine was not the natural outcome of a historical evolution of two distinct national identities, but rather subject to colonial whim when that emerges the major arbiter of the new artificial national identities. Similar considerations were operative in the delineation of the artificial boundaries between neighboring states. This colonial behavior created artificial proto-states that challenged the development of a unified national consciousness and fractionate national efforts of liberation. The imprint of colonial intent is the demarcation of the artificial states in the Near East, is illustrated by the best case of the district of Mosul. On December 1, 1918, Lloyd George struck a deal with Clemenceau during the latter visit to London, against the concession that Palestine would pass into British control and Mosul attached to Mesopotamia. Lloyd George promised his support for a French mandate in Syria, which included not only the littoral but also the hinterland. The agreement survived the subsequent squabbles during the Paris Peace Conference and served as a model for the arrangements at the San Remo Conference. The allocation of the Mosul Vilayet in the San Remo agreement was a significant departure from the 1916 Sykes-Picot agreement that assigned the District of France. At San Remo, the interests of the two powers in the oil fields of Iraq influenced the decisions and partitions of lands. The British government agreed to grant France a share in the crude oil or development of the oil fields. Arrangements were made to transport oil from Iraq and Iran through the French sphere of influence into the eastern Mediterranean. In consideration of this agreement and the need to secure British support of the French claims in the face of rising independent movement in Syrian areas occupied by the British, France officially conceded Mosul district for inclusion into Iraq. The separation of Syria between the two spheres of influence under competing colonial powers had a profound effect on political and economic developments in the country. Both northern Syria under the French and southern Syria under the British would be subjected to administrative processes that undermine any effort at national unity or the emergence of effective unified resistance to foreign rule. As discussed below, in the north, the French sought to create conditions favorable to their extended control of the region. In the south, the British had a similar aim, with the added element of fulfilling their commitment to the creation of a Jewish national home. Both parties sought to undermine each other's activities by giving refuge and sustenance to any movement capable of disrupting the plans of the competing party. Two major phases can be discerned in the French Mandate and the political and administrative organizations of the states under France's tutelage prior to the founding of the SSNP. The first phase extends from General Gouraud's arrival in Beirut on November 21, 1919, to the insurrection of 1925. The second phase, integrated by the appointment of Henri de Jovenel as High Commissioner, ends with the defining of the Statut Organique in May of 1930. In the first phase, the two major developments took place. The territory under the French Mandate was organized into separate states, and each of these states was given a representative government. The French determined that as a policy, Syria should be divided into segments with an indigenous facade behind which the French acted at will. This is explicitly stated by a diplomat by the Quai d'Orsay in May of 1920. From now on, it is necessary to consider that the regime will follow our occupation and will allow us to maintain our position with reduced military resources. The need is for an indigenous facade which is reasonably consistent, behind which we can operate without direct responsibility in the way under the circumstances which we judge useful. The possibility of an Arab dynasty residing over a unified Syria being excluded. It would seem that there would be no danger in leaving the various ethnic groups by themselves, or with help requested from us, to establish a framework for their national autonomy. It will therefore be essential to make the study of those ethnic groups, from which many, as soon as possible, constitute the first regional autonomous units. The architect of the administrative reshaping of Syria was General Henri Gouraud, 1867 to 1946, an experienced colonialist and battle-hardened military commander. At the end of his stay in Syria, French Prime Minister Bounikar celebrated him as le pacificateur et l'organisateur de la Syrie from August 31st, 1920 to December 20th of the same year. General Gouraud created and organized the separate states of Grand Lebanon, Damascus, Aleppo, and the Alawites. The state of Jabal el-Druze was not constituted until October 24, 1922. To maintain stability, the French created representative governments, initially by appointment and subsequently by a combination of limited elections and appointments. Gouraud was the executor of this policy of fragmentation, and the colonial formation was fairly advanced by all levels of the French government. The insurrection of 1925 inaugurated the second phase, and while the aim of the insurrection was never to transform the political landscape, it did accelerate the transformation of political institutions. The French continued to have challenges in securing cooperative local politicians in some parts of the country. Even after the brutal suppression of the insurrection of 1925, in the recently created states of Grand Lebanon and the Alawites region, cooperation was relatively easy to secure. The new High Commissioner, Henri de Jovenel, signed the Lebanese Constitution on May 23, 1926. He attempted to call for elections and constitutional assembly in the Syrian state, but it took a general boycott of the elections to put an end to this endeavor. It took 2 years until April 28th before the High Commissioner, Henri Poussin, called new elections. The assembly met first on June 9th, and after 2 months of deliberations, adopted a constitution to establish a parliamentary regime. However, the articles of the constitution were incompatible with the existence of the mandate, and the High Commissioner consequently dissolved the assembly. After another lapse of 2 years, Henri Poussin issued in May 1930 the organizational framework for all the states under French mandate. To the 115 articles of the Constitution prepared by the suspended Constitutional Assembly of the Syrian state, he added Article 116, defining the role of the mandatory authorities vis-a-vis rule safeguarding full French privileges. The so-called Statut Organique enshrined the separate political and administrative organizations of the states of Lebanon, Syria, Damascus, Aleppo, Jabal el-Druze, Alawites, and the district of Alexandria. While not allowing for any federal umbrella for these distinct political and administrative units, a French commentator judged such endeavor premature. The French nevertheless create a semblance of an economic unity by instituting the Conference des Intérêts Communs, with the aim of enhancing commerce and encouraging an economic revival. All these permutations illustrate the perpetual determination of the French to maintain quasi-permanent control over the lands under the Mandate. In Palestine, the efforts of the collusion between the Mandatory Authority and the Zionist Initiative were operative at various levels. The political, colonial, and demographic aspects of this geography of southern Syria was being modified, and the ability of southern Syrians or Palestinians to resist this transformation was systematically undermined. The British were keen to prevent development of any para-state organizations that would allow Palestinians to protect their very existence in the fabric of their communities. Unlike other parts of Syria, Lebanon, the hinterland, and Jordan, where semblance of national states was established, and Syrians participated to various degrees in their affairs and had a de facto apprenticeship and self-ruled state organization. The Syrians of Palestine were totally prevented from these pursuits. In contrast, Jewish para-state organizations were given free rein. The British resorted to partitioning of southern Syria to suit their colonial need. Like other states in geographic Syria, Transjordan was artificial creation. The ephemeral Syrian kingdom of Faisal was inclusive of Transjordan. With the defeat of Syrian forces in Mayas-Alun in June 1920, the reign came under the control of the British. The British shied away from direct rule and established several governing authorities, at least 6, based on tribal regional affiliations with British officers posted to each. These local governments were scrapped in favor of a united region called Transjordan under Emir Abdallah in March 1921. The borders of the region were established by agreements with the French, who relinquished El Atma to Transjordan, and the triumph of the Saudi government, who had overthrown Abdallah's father, King Hussein of the Hajj. When on March 27, 1921, the British recognized Emir Abdallah as provisional leader of the District of Transjordan, they did so to dissuade King Hussein's impetuous son from executing his threat to take military action against the French in Syria. London feared this attempt might provide an excuse for French forces to move into the British claim zone. The draft of the Palestine Mandate was revised in August of 1921 to exclude Transjordan from said mandate. Later, a distinction between Palestine and Transjordan was made to limit the commitment of the British to the Jewish national home. For the next decade, a close supervisory control by the Mandate was exercised through a variety of means. The constant of arrangement, however, was the alignment of the Transjordanian policy and activity with the aims of the Mandate to avoid any exacerbation of relations with the French. It is in this light that one needs to understand that the efforts of Emir Abdullah to eliminate all anti-French activities originating in his region, in effect, in the words of Churchill, Abdullah has kept to execute a complete volte-face and to take steps to nullify the effects of his previous policy. The British were not ready to allow Transjordan to remain a hotbed of nationalist activity against the French. This meant that a progressive purge of elements in the local government and armed forces that were anti-French and their replacement with regional representatives would align to the Emir. Tribal chiefs as well as urban intellectuals ordered Transjordan was for the Transjordanians, creating a new separatist mentality under the firm control of an ambitious leader. In this nationalist landscape, the mere existence of Syria as a viable national entity was seriously jeopardized, hence the primordial existence of the definition of nationhood and the ideology of the SSNP. Okay, thank you.